May 15, 1944. At a railway station in northeastern Hungary, a train pulls out of Kassa. Inside are more than 3,000 people, men, women, children, packed into sealed cattle wagons. No food, no water, barely any air. The journey will last days. When the doors finally open, they will not arrive at a prison. They will arrive at Auschwitz-Birkenau, and within hours, most of them will be dead. But this is not a story about Germany alone. Because this train is not German, it is Hungarian. The guards are Hungarian. The officials who organize the deportation are Hungarian. The railway system moving these people across Europe is Hungarian. In just 56 days during the summer of 1944, Hungary will deport 437,000 of its own Jewish citizens to Nazi death camps. The fastest mass deportation of the Holocaust. Not under direct German administration, not through chaos or collapse, but through the coordinated effort of a functioning state. And yet in most accounts of World War II, Hungary barely registers, a footnote in a war dominated by Nazi Germany. That is a mistake, because Hungary was not simply dragged into Hitler's war. It aligned with him, it bargained with him, it fought alongside him on the Eastern Front, and in the end, it helped carry out one of the most rapid and devastating acts of mass murder in modern history. So how does a nation become this? How does a country with a long-established Jewish population, deeply integrated, patriotic, woven into national life, turn on its own citizens with such speed and efficiency? And why in 1944, when Germany was already losing the war, did Hungary accelerate the killing instead of slowing it down? To answer those questions, we have to go back. Back before Hitler, back before the war, back to a moment of national trauma that reshaped everything Hungary believed about itself, and what it was willing to do to reverse its fate. This is the story of Hungary in World War II. Not as a bystander, but as one of Hitler's most consequential and most overlooked allies. To understand Hungary's choices in World War II, you must first understand what Hungary lost in World War I. Before 1918, the Kingdom of Hungary was one of the twin pillars of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, a vast, multi-ethnic state that stretched from the Alps to the Carpathians, from Bohemia to the Adriatic Sea. Hungary itself governed a territory of roughly 325,000 square kilometers. It was a major European power, with Budapest as one of the continent's most magnificent capitals. Then came defeat. The Treaty of Trianon, signed on June 4, 1920, was among the most punishing peace settlements in modern European history, at least from the perspective of the nation that bore it. Hungary lost 67% of its pre-war territory. It lost 72% of its population. Entire Hungarian-speaking communities in Transylvania, Slovakia, and the former Yugoslavia found themselves suddenly living under foreign flags. Cities that had been Hungarian for centuries were handed to Romania, Czechoslovakia, and the newly formed Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes. For Hungarians, Trianon was not merely a diplomatic reverse. It was a national trauma, a humiliation burned into the country's collective memory with a ferocity that would shape its politics for generations. The word that defined Hungarian political life in the interwar period was revisio, revision. The revision of Trianon, the restoration of lost lands. Every major political movement, from moderate conservatives to radical nationalists, wrapped itself in the flag of territorial recovery. It was the animating idea of the era, and it created a vulnerability, because any foreign power willing to promise Hungary what it had lost would find a receptive audience in Budapest. That receptive audience found its most important interwar leader in Miklós Horthy. Horthy was an unusual figure, a former admiral in the Austro-Hungarian Navy. a navy that no longer existed, serving a fleet that had no sea. He had led the counter-revolutionary forces that crushed Hungary's short-lived Soviet Republic in 1919. In the violence that followed, known to history as the White Terror, thousands of socialists, communists, and Jews were killed by Horthy's paramilitaries. It was Hungary's first organized political massacre of the 20th century. It would not be the last. In 1920, Horthy was declared Regent of Hungary. The kingdom nominally still existed, but it had no king. Horthy would serve as its head of state for the next 25 years, navigating a complicated path between democratic pretense and authoritarian reality. He was conservative, nationalist, anti-communist, and anti-Semitic in the tepid, almost reflexive way that was common among the European aristocracy of his generation. He did not hate Jews with ideological fervor, but he accepted their subordination as natural, appropriate, even necessary. In 1920, Hungary became the first country in post-war Europe to pass a modern anti-Semitic law, the Numerus Clausus, limiting Jewish enrollment in universities to 5% of the student body. This law came not from German pressure. It came from the Hungarian government itself. Throughout the 1920s and early 1930s, Hungary drifted in a sullen, resentful semi-isolation. Trianon had made it a revisionist state by definition, but Britain and France, the architects of the peace settlement, showed no interest in accommodating Hungarian grievances. Italy's Benito Mussolini offered warmer relations, and Hungary gravitated toward Rome. Then, after 1933, something more consequential emerged on Hungary's doorstep. Adolf Hitler came to power in Germany. For Horthy and the Hungarian political establishment, Hitler represented a dilemma wrapped in an opportunity. His ideology was extreme, his methods were alarming, but his fundamental objective, the revision of the post-war settlement, aligned almost perfectly with Hungarian national ambition. And unlike Britain or France, Hitler was actively dismantling the European order that had crippled Hungary. The question was not whether to engage with Nazi Germany. The question was how much to pay for what Germany could offer. By the mid-1930s, Hungary had begun to move into Germany's orbit. Trade ties deepened, political sympathies shifted, and when Hitler began making his first territorial demands in 1938, first Austria, then the Sudetenland, the Hungarian government watched carefully, calculating how best to position itself to benefit from what was coming. The answer was closer than anyone in Budapest could have predicted, and it would cost Hungary everything. In November 1938, 6 weeks after the Munich Agreement gave Hitler the Sudetenland, Germany and Italy delivered a gift to Hungary. The first Vienna Award transferred a strip of southern Slovakia and Carpathian Ruthenia, territories with large Hungarian-speaking populations, back to Hungarian control. At a stroke, Hungary had recovered a piece of what it had lost at Trianon, without firing a single shot. The jubilation in Budapest was overwhelming. Crowds filled the streets, church bells rang across the country. Horthy rode into the recovered city of Kassa on a white horse like a medieval king reclaiming his kingdom. The imagery was intoxicating and deliberately chosen. But the price was now visible if anyone chose to look. Hungary had received its gift from Hitler's hands, and Hitler did not give gifts without expectation of return. In August 1940, a second Vienna Award followed. This time, the prize was Northern Transylvania, roughly 43,000 square kilometers seized from Romania, containing nearly 2.5 million people, including a substantial Hungarian-speaking population. Once again, Germany and Italy served as arbiters. Once again, Hungary received the territory it coveted. Once again, the debt grew. By 1940, Hungary had formally joined the Tripartite Pact, the alliance binding Germany, Italy, and Japan. It was not a secret collaboration, it was a public commitment. Hungary had chosen its side. Prime Minister Pál Teleki was one of the few Hungarian leaders who understood, with genuine clarity, where this path led. A distinguished geographer and patriot, Teleki had signed the tripartite pact under pressure, but he harbored serious doubts about alignment with Hitler. When Germany demanded that Hungary allow German troops to cross its territory to invade Yugoslavia in April 1941, Teleki found himself trapped. Hungary had signed a friendship treaty with Yugoslavia barely 5 months earlier. To permit the invasion would be a betrayal of that treaty, a moral capitulation, and a demonstration to the entire world that Hungarian sovereignty was effectively fictitious. On April 3, 1941, Pál Teleki shot himself. His suicide note to Horthy was brief and devastating. He wrote that Hungary had, through its actions, become an accomplice to villainy, that the nation had broken its word, that he could not bear the disgrace. Horthy replaced him and proceeded with the invasion. Hungarian troops crossed into Yugoslavia. Hungary received the Bachka region and other territories in the subsequent dismemberment of Yugoslavia. The pattern was now established. Collaborate, receive territory, accumulate dishonor, continue collaborating. Within weeks of the Yugoslav operation, Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. Horthy, without consulting parliament and motivated partly by ideology, partly by fear of losing German favor, committed Hungarian forces to the Eastern Front. The decision was made without a formal declaration of war. It was simply announced Hungary was now fighting in the largest land war in human history, on the side of Adolf Hitler, deep inside Soviet territory. What no one in Budapest could fully appreciate in the summer of 1941 was that Hungary's soldiers, undertrained, under-equipped, under-supported, were being sent toward a catastrophe, and that the catastrophe on the Eastern Front would have consequences not just for those soldiers, but for hundreds of thousands of Hungarian civilians who had nothing to do with military strategy at all. The machine was moving, and it was very difficult to stop a machine once it had started. The Hungarian Second Army arrived on the Eastern Front in the spring of 1942. It was approximately 200,000 men. It was assigned to hold a 200-kilometer stretch of the Don River front in the southern Soviet Union, serving as part of the German Army Group South's extended flank. The position was strategically critical, but militarily untenable. The Hungarian soldiers had insufficient artillery, minimal anti-tank capability, and winter equipment that was wholly inadequate for the Russian cold. They were, in a very real sense, filler, placed there to free up German divisions for more offensive operations further south. That calculation would prove catastrophic. In January 1943, following the Soviet counter-offensive that encircled the German Sixth Army at Stalingrad, Soviet forces launched Operation Ostrogozhsk-Rossosh. The attack struck the Hungarian Second Army's position with overwhelming force. The Hungarians were outgunned, outmanned, and in many cases, literally frozen. Temperatures had dropped to minus 30 or 40 degrees Celsius, and many soldiers could not operate their weapons. The front collapsed. In 2 weeks of fighting, the Hungarian Second Army was effectively destroyed. Casualty estimates vary, but most historians place Hungarian losses at somewhere between 120,000 and 150,000 dead, wounded, captured, or missing. Villages across Hungary received the news of fathers, sons, and brothers who would never return. It was the worst military disaster in Hungarian history. Back in Budapest, the catastrophe on the Don created both grief and a quiet awakening among some members of the Hungarian elite. If this was what alignment with Germany produced, perhaps the alignment needed to be reconsidered. But reconsidering the alliance was far more complicated than it sounded. Germany had given Hungary territory. If Hungary defected to the Allied side, Germany would presumably take that territory back and bring military occupation with it. The Hungarian government was trapped in the logic of its own bargains. Every gain it had accepted from Hitler had become another chain. There was also an internal political dimension that made any turn toward the Allies profoundly dangerous. Within Hungary, the far-right Arrow Cross movement, Hungary's own fascist party, openly modeled on the Nazis, had grown steadily in influence throughout the late 1930s and into the war. Arrow Cross leaders like Ferenc Szálasi commanded genuine popular support, especially among the urban poor and the military lower ranks. They were impatient with the Horthy's perceived moderation. They wanted Hungary to go further, faster, in every direction that mattered to the radical right. The Arrow Cross watched the government. They had eyes in every institution. Any sign of wavering, any hint of secret negotiations with the Western Allies would potentially trigger a coup from the right, or, far worse, invite German intervention. Horthy began, cautiously and clumsily, to seek a way out. He entered into discreet contact with Allied representatives. He replaced ministers he considered too pro-German with figures he believed were more pragmatic. In the spring of 1944, with Soviet forces advancing rapidly and the Allied invasion of Italy already underway, Horthy believed he was maneuvering skillfully, that he was playing a complicated game and winning. He was wrong. Germany had been watching too. In the early hours of March 19, 1944, German forces crossed the Hungarian border. There was no declaration of war, there was no ultimatum, there was no formal resistance. German troops simply entered Hungary and occupied it, moving into Budapest by morning, taking control of key infrastructure, government buildings, and communication centers before most Hungarian citizens had finished their breakfast. Hitler had summoned Horthy to a meeting in Germany on March 18th, a personal, face-to-face conversation at Schloss Klesheim in Austria, while Horthy sat in a gilded room being told that Germany had reliable information about Hungary's disloyalty. German forces were already crossing his country's borders. The meeting was a staged distraction. The occupation had been planned for months. Horthy returned to Hungary to find it under German military control. What he chose to do next defines his historical legacy and Hungary's. He did not resign. He did not call on Hungarians to resist. He did not attempt to flee abroad and establish a government in exile, as the Norwegian king had done in 1940. He stayed. He remained regent. He accepted the German demands for a new, more compliant government and agreed to the appointment of Dömer Storgé, the former Hungarian ambassador to Berlin, as prime minister. Horthy told himself he could limit the damage by remaining in place, that his presence would restrain the worst excesses, that a Hungarian figurehead was better than direct German rule. The next 56 days would test that argument almost beyond endurance. What the German occupation brought to Hungary was not simply military control. It brought Adolf Eichmann. SS Obersturmbannführer Adolf Eichmann arrived in Budapest on March 19, 1944, the same day as the German troops. He came with a small team of specialists, a set of plans, and a single, focused purpose: the deportation of Hungary's Jewish population to Auschwitz-Birkenau. The Jews of Hungary, approximately 725,000 people, were the largest remaining Jewish community in German-controlled Europe. For years, despite the discrimination of the Hungarian state's anti-Semitic laws, they had survived. The Hungarian government had repeatedly refused German requests to hand them over. Some Jews had even begun to believe that Hungary might, somehow, be different. Eichmann's arrival ended that belief. What followed was a masterpiece of bureaucratic evil. Eichmann did not need to bring thousands of German personnel to Hungary. He needed only the cooperation of the Hungarian state, and the Hungarian state, under its new Storgé government, cooperated with almost no hesitation. The Hungarian gendarmerie, the Szendőrség, was assigned the task of concentrating Jews in provincial Hungary. They moved through town after town with brutal efficiency, forcing Jewish communities into designated ghettos, confiscating property, separating families. Hungarian civil administrators organized the logistics. Hungarian railways provided the trains. Eichmann later described his operation in Hungary as the smoothest he had ever conducted. The bureaucratic machinery was almost entirely Hungarian. Germany provided the destination and the ideology. Hungary provided the infrastructure. The first transports left on May 15, 1944. The process was methodical. The country was divided into zones, and the deportations proceeded zone by zone, beginning in the northeast and moving progressively toward the capital. In each zone, the pattern was identical: concentration, ghettoization, collection at a central point, then loading onto trains. The trains went to Auschwitz. At Auschwitz, Hungarian Jews encountered the full apparatus of the Nazi killing system. On the ramp, the selection platform, SS doctors, including Josef Mengele, conducted the selection. Those deemed fit for labor were directed one way. The old, the young, the weak, the mothers with children, they were directed another way. They were told they were going to shower facilities. They were not. The scale was extraordinary and almost incomprehensible. In some weeks during May and June 1944, the transports from Hungary were arriving at such a rate that Auschwitz-Birkenau's crematoria could not process the dead quickly enough. Mass graves were dug. Bodies were burned in open pits. The camp's own records show the extraordinary pressure on its killing capacity during this period. By July 9, 1944, approximately 437,000 Hungarian Jews had been deported, almost entirely to Auschwitz. Of these, it is estimated that around 320,000 were killed on arrival, or within a short time of arrival. This had happened in 56 days. Throughout this period, information about what was occurring was available, if anyone chose to look. In April 1944, two Auschwitz prisoners, Rudolf Vrba and Alfred Wetzler, had escaped from the camp and made their way to Slovakia, where they compiled a detailed, accurate account of Auschwitz's operations, the killing infrastructure, the selection process, the number of dead. This document, known as the Vrba-Wetzler Report, reached Hungarian Jewish leaders in early May, just as the deportations were beginning. It reached Pope Pius XII. It reached the Swiss press. It reached the American government. The deportations continued. In Budapest, some Hungarian leaders began to have second thoughts, not necessarily from moral revulsion, but from a growing realization that Germany was losing the war and that being identified as the architect of mass murder might have consequences at the peace table. By June, Allied landings in Normandy had opened a second front in Western Europe. Soviet forces were advancing. The Third Reich was contracting on every side. In late June and early July, Horthy received a series of communications that created genuine alarm. Pope Pius XII sent a direct appeal. The King of Sweden, Gustav V, sent a personal message. President Franklin Roosevelt warned of severe consequences. Even the leader of neutral Switzerland expressed concern. On July 6, 1944, Horthy ordered the deportation stopped. It was, by any measure, an inadequate act of belated conscience. Hundreds of thousands were already dead. The Budapest Jewish community, some 200,000 people, was spared immediate deportation, but their situation remained desperate. And within Hungary, the forces that had conducted the deportations were still in place, still armed, still ideologically committed to completing what had been started. Horthy had stopped the trains, but he had not dismantled the machine that had built them. On October 15, 1944, Miklós Horthy made the announcement he had been trying and failing to make for months. On Hungarian state radio, his voice cracking, Horthy declared that Hungary was seeking an armistice with the Soviet Union. He acknowledged that Germany had lost the war. He called on Hungarian soldiers to lay down their arms. He had made critical errors in the preparation. He had not coordinated effectively with Hungarian military commanders. He had not secured key installations in Budapest. He had not ensured that the broadcast would be followed by action on the ground. The announcement was, in effect, words, without the military reality to back them up. The Germans had anticipated this moment. They had a plan. Operation Panzerfaust was an SS operation led by the commando Otto Skorzeny, the same man who had rescued Mussolini from Italian custody in 1943. Its objective was to neutralize Horthy's armistice declaration and replace him with a government that would continue the war. Skorzeny's team kidnapped Horthy's son, Miklós Horthy Jr., rolling him in a carpet and transporting him to a German aircraft. Within hours, Horthy was presented with a choice: resign, or his son would be killed. Horthy resigned. He was taken to Germany, where he would spend the rest of the war under loose German custody. He would survive. Within hours of Horthy's removal, Ferenc Szálasi and the Arrow Cross Party assumed power in Hungary. Hungary's experiment with conservative, calculating collaboration was over. What replaced it was something raw, more fanatical, and more immediately murderous. The Arrow Cross government was Nazi Hungary without the Nazi discipline. Where the Stojan government had conducted its crimes through bureaucratic machinery, the Arrow Cross operated through direct terror. Arrow Cross militiamen roamed the streets of Budapest, pulling Jews from apartments, from hospitals, from hiding places. They marched them to the banks of the Danube, made them remove their shoes, and shot them into the river. The shoes were collected and sent to the German war economy. The bodies were swept downstream. An estimated 10,000 to 15,000 Jews were killed in Budapest in the Arrow Cross period, many in spontaneous acts of violence that had no bureaucratic authorization, driven by nothing more than ideology and the freedom to act on it without restraint. At the same time, the SS reorganized the deportation of surviving Hungarian Jews. Unable to use rail transport to Auschwitz, the railways were increasingly disrupted by Allied bombing and Soviet advances. Eichmann organized forced marches. Tens of thousands of men, women, and elderly people were marched on foot from Budapest toward the Austrian border, a distance of hundreds of kilometers through the autumn cold. Thousands died on the roads. Those who survived were delivered to slave labor projects in Austria. In the midst of this darkness, a small number of individuals from neutral countries undertook extraordinary rescue operations. Raoul Wallenberg, a Swedish diplomat, issued Swedish protective passports to tens of thousands of Hungarian Jews, placing them in Swedish protected buildings in Budapest. Karl Lutz, a Swiss vice consul, extended similar protection. The papal nuncio, Angelo Rota, issued papers on behalf of the Vatican. These men operated at genuine personal risk, in direct defiance of both Arrow Cross violence and German pressure. They saved thousands of lives. Budapest itself was now a battlefield. Soviet forces had encircled the Hungarian capital in December 1944. The siege of Budapest, one of the most ferocious urban battles of the entire war, lasted until February 1945. Roughly 38,000 German and Hungarian soldiers, plus around 800,000 civilians, were trapped inside. The fighting was savage. Entire districts were reduced to rubble. Civilian casualties were enormous. When German and Hungarian commanders finally attempted a breakout on February 11, 1945, they were largely annihilated. Budapest fell on February 13, 1945. The war in Hungary continued until April, as the last German and Hungarian units were pushed from the country's western regions. The Arrow Cross government collapsed. Szálasi fled west. He was captured, tried, and executed in 1946. Hungary lay in ruins. The Soviet Union liberated Hungary. That is the factually accurate phrase. It is also a phrase that describes only part of the reality. Soviet forces drove out the Germans and ended the Arrow Cross terror. They also brought their own form of occupation. By 1947, a Soviet-backed communist government had taken power in Budapest. By 1949, Hungary was a people's republic within the Soviet bloc. For the next 4 decades, Hungarian history was written according to Soviet templates. The official narrative emphasized fascist aggression and communist liberation. It was not a narrative that encouraged honest examination of Hungarian complicity in the Holocaust. The perpetrators were categorized as fascists and foreign agents. The Hungarian state, its gendarmerie, its civil service, its railway workers, was largely absolved in the official memory. Survivors were discouraged from speaking. Memorials were limited. The reckoning that was desperately needed did not come. There were trials in the immediate post-war years. Several Hungarian officials directly involved in the deportations were prosecuted. László Endre and László Baky, the 2 state secretaries who had organized the ghettoization and deportation process with extraordinary bureaucratic enthusiasm, were tried, convicted, and executed in 1946. Dermes Tolja was executed the same year. But the trial process was incomplete, politically motivated in its own way, and left vast institutional complicity unexamined. Horthy himself was never tried for war crimes. He had been taken to Germany by the Nazis, which gave him a certain ambiguous victim status in Allied eyes. More practically, American intelligence found him potentially useful during the early Cold War, when any anti-communist figure acquired value by default. He died in exile in Portugal in 1957, maintaining until the end that his choices had been necessary and that he bore no personal responsibility for the deportations. That claim requires examination. The facts are not ambiguous. The Hungarian gendarmerie operated under Hungarian state authority. The administrative structure that concentrated, ghettoized, and transported Jewish citizens was Hungarian. The deportations were carried out while Horthy remained nominally in power. He did not order them, but he did not stop them until July 1944, and even then only under intense international pressure. The argument that he was constrained, that he was operating within the terrible logic of German occupation, that he stopped the Budapest deportations and thereby saved a significant number of lives. These arguments have their place in a nuanced historical assessment. They do not constitute exoneration. Hungary's confrontation with this history has been slow and deeply uneven. In the post-communist period, beginning in 1989, genuine historical research became possible. Hungarian historians, archivists, and documentary filmmakers began the difficult work of examining what actually happened. The evidence that emerged was damaging, not because it revealed German control, that had always been known, but because it demonstrated how extensively Hungarian institutions had collaborated beyond what German pressure strictly required. Some of the key figures in organizing the deportations had been enthusiastic, not merely compliant. László Endre, one of the executed state secretaries, had been an obsessive anti-Semite who had championed Jewish persecution long before the German occupation. The Hungarian gendarmerie had applied violence in the ghetto concentration process that went beyond German expectations. There were documented instances of Hungarian officials accelerating the deportations, not slowing them. The political and cultural struggle over this history has continued in the 21st century. In 2014, the Hungarian government erected a memorial in Budapest that portrayed Hungary as a victim of German aggression. An eagle representing Germany attacking the Archangel Gabriel representing Hungary. The memorial provoked fierce protests from Holocaust survivors, historians, and Jewish organizations who argued that it obscured and falsified Hungarian responsibility. The controversy was not merely academic. It reflected a live debate about national identity, about what kind of past Hungary chooses to claim, and about whether honest memory is compatible with national pride. These are questions without easy answers. They are the questions that serious historical reckoning always produces. And they are, in their own way, the questions that this story was always going to force us to ask. 600,000. That is the scholarly consensus on the number of Hungarian Jews who perished in the Holocaust. Out of a pre-war community of approximately 825,000, roughly 75% were killed. In the countryside, Jewish communities that had existed for centuries, communities of craftsmen, farmers, professionals, teachers, simply ceased to exist. Entire cultural worlds were erased. The Hungarian Jewish community that survived was concentrated disproportionately in Budapest, where the deportations had been halted in July 1944 and where Wallenberg, Lutz, and others had operated their rescue networks. Even there, thousands had been killed by the Arrow Cross in the final months. The non-Jewish Hungarian civilian population also paid an enormous price. Estimates of total Hungarian war deaths, including military casualties, civilian deaths from bombing, the Budapest siege, post-war political executions and population transfers, range from 400,000 to 600,000. The country lost approximately a quarter of its national wealth. Industry was shattered, infrastructure destroyed. When Soviet forces finally departed in the late 1940s, to be replaced by Soviet-backed domestic authorities, Hungary was economically and politically broken. What had it gained? Nothing that lasted. Every territorial acquisition made through the Vienna Awards, northern Transylvania, southern Slovakia, the Yugoslav territories, was surrendered at the 1947 Paris Peace Treaty. The borders of 1937, which Hungary had considered an unbearable humiliation, were essentially restored. The entire project of revisionism, the national obsession that had driven Hungary into Hitler's embrace, had achieved nothing except to compound the original catastrophe. The bitter irony is stark. Trianon had been genuinely unjust in certain respects, particularly as in the treatment of ethnically Hungarian populations who found themselves on the wrong side of redrawn borders. Those grievances deserved diplomatic address, but the decision to seek their resolution through partnership with the most murderous regime in modern history did not recover lost territories. It traded them for a generation of destruction and the blood of hundreds of thousands of the country's own citizens. History offers no clean counterfactuals. We cannot know what Hungary might have achieved through different choices. But we can note that Finland, facing far more direct Soviet military pressure, fought its wars defensively and managed to preserve both its independence and its democratic character through the conflict. Bulgaria, another German ally, largely protected its Jewish population from deportation despite German pressure. The choices made in Budapest between 1938 and 1944 were not the only choices available. They were chosen. Raoul Wallenberg, who had saved tens of thousands of Hungarian Jewish lives through personal courage and diplomatic ingenuity, was arrested by Soviet forces in Budapest in January 1945. The Soviets suspected him, apparently, of being an American spy. He was taken to Moscow and imprisoned. He was never seen in public again. The Soviet government claimed for decades that he had died in their custody in 1947. The full truth of his fate has never been established. It is a coda appropriate to the story. A man who represented the best of human possibility, who used bureaucracy as a tool of rescue rather than destruction, who risked his life to oppose the machine. Devoured in the end by a different machine. His memory endures. His fate remains unresolved. Elie Wiesel, who survived Auschwitz and Buchenwald and went on to become one of the 20th century's most important witnesses to the Holocaust, was a native of Sighetu Marmației, a city in northern Transylvania that had been returned to Hungary under the Second Vienna Award. He was 15 years old when he and his family were deported from their home by Hungarian gendarmerie in May 1944. In his memoir, he described the moment of departure. The community that had existed for generations, the synagogue, the courtyard, the familiar street, all of it receding as the transport moved away. He did not understand at that moment what awaited him. He survived to tell the world. Most of his community did not. What the story of Hungary in World War II ultimately reveals is not simply the anatomy of one country's moral failure. It reveals the mechanisms by which ordinary institutions, governments, police forces, civil services, railway companies can become instruments of mass murder, not despite being ordinary, but precisely because of it. Because their ordinariness made them effective. Because their officials came to work each morning, filed their papers, followed their orders, and went home for dinner. Historian Christopher Browning, examining a different but related context, titled one of the defining works on this subject, Ordinary Men. The men who ran the Hungarian gendarmerie, who filled out the deportation forms, who sealed the railway cars. They were, in their way, ordinary men. They had families. They had careers. They had the full complement of human characteristics that most people possess. And they did what they did. The question that history leaves us with is not only, how did this happen? That question has answers, and they have been laboriously assembled by decades of scholarship. The question that history refuses to close is the harder one. What would I have done? That question has no safe answer. It is meant to remain open. It is meant to be uncomfortable. Because the point of remembering Hungary's role in the Second World War, the point of understanding how a constitutional government became a partner in genocide, is not academic. It is not merely a matter of historical record-keeping, however essential that record-keeping is. The point is vigilance. The point is recognizing that the mechanisms of atrocity rarely announce themselves as such. They are built piece by piece, law by law, restriction by restriction, until the machinery is in place and the people who might have stopped it have grown accustomed to its presence, have normalized it, have told themselves that their continued participation limits the damage, that the alternative would be worse, that the system is too powerful to resist, that they have no choice. Hungary chose. Every step of the way, choices were made by real people with real power and real alternatives. Some chose to resist. A handful of diplomats issued protective papers and argued with officials at gunpoint. A few Hungarian officers refused orders. Thousands of ordinary Hungarians hid their Jewish neighbors at enormous personal risk. Their example, too, is part of the record. History is not a verdict on the dead. It is a mirror held up to the living. May it reflect something we can bear to look at. May 15th, 1944. The first train left Kassa. It carried 3,000 people. It was the first of 148 transports. Within 56 days, 437,000 human beings had been carried across that same route to the same destination, on machinery built and operated by the Hungarian state. The architects of that machinery, the officials who drew up the zones, organized the ghettos, scheduled the transports, calculated the capacity, were not monsters in any supernatural sense. They were bureaucrats. They were nationalists. They were men who had convinced themselves that what they were doing served the interests of Hungary. They were catastrophically wrong. Hungary entered the Second World War in pursuit of a dream, the restoration of its lost greatness, the recovery of territories stripped away at Trianon, the affirmation of national identity through strength. It achieved, through 2 decades of calculated collaboration and 6 years of war, the following: the death of more than half its Jewish citizens, hundreds of thousands of non-Jewish military and civilian casualties, the destruction of its economy, the loss of all territorial gains it had made through the alliance with Hitler, and 40 years of Soviet domination. The dream cost everything it claimed to protect. The challenge that Hungary's history poses is not unique to Hungary. Every nation has its version of this temptation. The moment when ambition overrides ethics, when national grievance is allowed to justify escalating compromise, when the machinery, once built, seems too powerful and too efficient to dismantle. Every nation has its version of the men who told themselves they were only following orders, that the alternative was worse, that they could limit the damage from the inside. Some nations have reckoned honestly with those moments. Others are still finding ways to look away. Hungary's reckoning is ongoing. The debates about memorials, about historical narratives, about who bears responsibility for what. These are not resolved. They are alive. They are contested. That is not in itself a sign of failure. A society that debates its past honestly, that refuses to allow comfort to replace truth, is one that takes the lessons seriously. What cannot be permitted, what history will not ultimately allow, is the claim that it simply happened, that it was purely external, that Hungary was a victim of circumstances beyond its control. The trains that left Kassa on May 15, 1944, were not German trains. They were Hungarian trains. They ran on time. If this story moved you, challenged you, or helped you see the Second World War differently, it would be an honor to have you join our growing community. Subscribing isn't just a click. It's a way to support more powerful stories, more forgotten voices, and more truth from the past. So if you believe these stories matter, hit that subscribe button, and let's keep building this journey together. And don't forget to leave a comment. We read everyone and love hearing your thoughts. Until next time, keep exploring history with Epic War. Keep asking questions. Keep seeking the truth.